And so, you know, in addition to the interpretation of the current code, there's some changes to the code. The code changes every 3 years. Then there's an interim code cycle at 18 months, and there's emergency code changes. And Jim and Ida and George are going to talk about, you know, some potential structural fire and access code changes. So, Jim.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. I've got a cheat sheet because these dates are kind of crazy, but the current code is the 2016 Title 24 California Code of Regulations, and the intervening supplemental provisions were adopted or approved in October of 2017, published in January of 2018, and they'll be effective in July 1 of 2018. So those are the intervening cycle, and there'll be the green pages that many of the architects and engineers have probably received as an update. But one of the things that I need to make sure you're aware of is that when changes are made to the administrative codes are effective 30 days after adoption. And pretty much anytime we do a code change cycle, there are some changes to the administrative codes. Those will be effective to you, and particularly when you come in for a pre-application meeting and you meet with the regional office, they can walk you through what those changes are. And I think that's very important that you understand the administrative changes go into effect early.
Jim, do you want to explain the difference between the administrative and the technical side for some folks that don't understand that?
Okay. The administrative code side are things, as Dan had kind of mentioned, it's how we process. And there may be requirements for the architects, the school districts, requirements for project inspectors and contractors, what they have to do in terms of submitting a project, in terms of getting a project certified in the end. And those are the general requirements of how to operate. The technical requirements of the building code, which would be your chapters of parts 2 through parts 11 or 12, those are going to be more your technical requirements of, you know, what are the structural regulations, what are the architectural requirements for access and fire, et cetera. So that's the difference between the two. And so the administrative regs go into effect earlier because it helps you in your initial planning and in terms of what your responsibilities are. The other things that have come up recently is that this last year, and this was adopted in December 27th, which are effective immediately because they were emergency regulations, were some regulations regarding the exterior balconies, or what the other term is that elevated exterior elements, which are walkways or balconies. Those provisions were adopted as an emergency. They are being adopted into the 2019 CBC, and with some additional amendments and work that's going on to determine how, if the emergencies were appropriate or if there needs to be any adjustments to those emergency regulations. So those are ongoing right now. We are currently we're getting very close to being done with our package for the 2019 CBC that will then be submitted to the Building Standards Commission for adoption at the end of this year. So if they're adopted, let's just pick a date. To pick it on January 1 of 2019, they'll be effective in January 1 of 2020. Don't forget, the administrative regs, though, will be effective approximately February of 2019. So that's the tricky part about the code and how they work. But so please be aware of that, and I take advantage of the preliminary meetings in order to make sure those are understood.
Just as an aside, so everybody understands, we're on a 3-year cycle by regulation. Actually, I guess it's by statute, the 3-year cycle, which is really kind of crazy. And at some point, we would look towards people beginning to say, we've got to change this because we're not making that significant of a change. We're fine-tuning things. But you can see where Jim and Ida and George are on, it's like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. You get to one end and you have to start all over again. And so we just want everybody to understand that's not something that we like to do. We'd like to actually expand that time. But we are married to the ICC at this particular point, which is on a 3-year cycle. And then we have what's called the intervening cycle. I never understood intervening. That's what I did with my kids when they were fighting. But where we do something at the 18-month period as well. It's a little bit crazy, folks. We're trying to work on that one as well. Sorry, Jim, but I thought it was important that they get the background piece.
No, I think that, thank you, Chet. Just by the way, as we're finishing up with our preparation of the new codes for the 2019 cycle, which will really be in the next week or two, we'll have our initial draft coordinated and ready for public input. We will be reaching out to AIA, to the Structural Engineers Association of California, to help review those provisions. And once we receive that feedback, then we will be making them available for a public comment to anybody and everybody, probably the end of this month. So 2 teammates of mine, Diane Gould and Brian Huxley, if you don't mind standing. These 2 folks are the ones to blame. So you can, they're doing an incredible job on a very, very difficult timeline. So anyway, tremendous job to them.
Thank you, Jim. So with regard to access, our most recent package that was passed in December, which will become effective July, yes. The intervening provisions. Really, the only one significant that I would say to schools is now there are locations for feminine hygiene product dispensers and bathrooms, so keep an eye out for that. Our intervening package is not always very hefty. A lot of it is clarification, but that one was new. We are in the middle of our 2018 triennial code cycle, just along with structural. And we are actually doing outreach right now on those provisions. We have assembled new for DSA Access, an Access Code Collaborative, which is a representative group of 13 stakeholders. That involves facility owners, including public entities. And so there is a position on the ACC for that. And we encourage you to get involved in the Access Code development process because, of course, it affects all of you and it's important. And so we do accept ongoing information, applications for the ACC, and there's a turnover of a few positions every 18 months. But we meet with our Access Code Collaborative along with going out for public comment. And so our next Access Code Collaborative meeting is tomorrow, and that's in our office with our 13 representative stakeholders. If you want to listen in, you're welcome to. It's not actually a public meeting where you can comment, but you can get information specifically from a representative stakeholder group and listen in on the process. If you Google DSA, ACC, the first one that comes up should be our Access Code Collaborative page, and you can click on it, and the teleconference information's on there. But in our public meetings, we did have one February 22nd. We have another coming up April 12th. And that is your opportunity to comment, and we do encourage you to become involved. Oftentimes when individuals such as yourselves review our package, you say, yeah, that sounds reasonable, that sounds good. I don't need to show up, I don't need to comment. And we encourage you to comment, whether you're for it or against it, any of the proposed access revisions. We do encourage both comments. A lot of times all that arises are negative comments, and then there's the perception that the world is against the provisions, and so we do encourage you to comment whether you are in support or not in support. Those provisions are posted to our website they'll be posted, the revised ones, by the end of this month. And again, our public outreach meeting is April 12th. You can attend via teleconference, so you can listen in, and we do provide an agenda so you have an idea when we're going to be actually presenting the provisions. But it's very important that you get involved in the access code development because it affects your work. Thanks.
Well, for fire and life safety, I'm pretty fortunate. I don't have to write regulations like Jim and Ida's staff do. By statute, fire and life safety regulations are promulgated by the Office of the State Fire Marshal, of which I and staff collaborate with them to make sure that any changes going forward are cooperatively achieved so that both their interests and our interests are considered when they do go forward. Of interest to you with the intervening code cycle, however, there are two changes that will take effect July 1st. One, as you may or may not know, Group E buildings, the corridors, will no longer be required to be fire rated if the building is protected by fire sprinklers. A lot of people are very happy about that. The second thing that goes in there was the fact that, as many of you know, fire alarm systems for schools are required to be both automatic and manual. Effective July 1, the manual provision will go away, so that schools will only be required to have automatic fire alarm systems. However, there will be one manual pull station still required in the admin space. So what can you do? How can you incorporate these things into your projects right now? If you are currently in design and plan on submitting prior to July 1, or you have a project that has not yet completed the back check process, you can incorporate these provisions into your design, and we have created an alternate design and materials methods request that you can submit to your regional office, and you may utilize the Building Standards Commission approval document as your justification for the change. If you read Part 1, the Administrative Code, or even Title 19 or the Building Code, usually to submit an alternate request for materials or design, there's 7 or 8 criteria that you have to meet and provide documentation and justification for that. Right now, instead of those 7 or 8 items for these two issues, you just get to use the Building Standards Commission approval document and you're good to go. So hopefully that'll help you out.
Okay, thanks, George.
Make a comment on that. This is a really good example of input coming from our clients, from you, that made changes. Laura was one of the people that really started talking about this because of the change in the pedagogy and how we teach and all the things that are happening, the need for collaborative space, etc. That's what grew. That's how this thing grew. So I'm urging you to take an active role in this process. You don't need to write the code, but you need to tell us about places that might be issues that are stopping us from moving forward in improving the educational environment. We can make changes. It is not set in stone. That doesn't mean we will make changes on everything, because obviously there are issues that we have to address, but we want to make this thing better for, again, the educational process. So remember that. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came from folks that were concerned about how we're moving forward.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. So at the preliminary meeting stage, during schematic design, in addition to code interpretations and potential code changes coming up that we can talk about, we'll also talk about your project schedule, and we'll try to do whatever we can to help you meet your schedule. If you've got an opening deadline or a funding deadline, and so it's real helpful to have this discussion when you're starting design, rather than submit the project to us and then say, oh yeah, by the way, we need it back by this date. At the preliminary stage, everyone's schedule can be adjusted somewhat. The architect may need to submit a little bit sooner, and we can also talk about increments. In order to meet your schedule, it may be helpful to break your project into increments. A common way to do it is to have the site work and the underground utilities in the first increment. That can be designed, reviewed, and approved much more quickly. That work can be started to be constructed while the buildings are being designed and reviewed. And if you've got a lot of buildings in a project, you can break the different buildings into different increment 2. So increment 1 might be site work, and you might have increments 2 with 2 buildings, increment 3 another 2, increment 4 with another 2. So those schemes have been used to help districts meet their schedule and have it open when they want to get the project ready for the school kids coming. So those are the type of things we can talk about. One additional thing is if you're doing alterations to existing buildings, depending on the scope of work you have and how much work you're going to do, it may trigger the entire building to be brought up to current code. There's 3 triggers, and again, they're in part 1. Part 1 of the administrative requirements. It's in section 4-309C, and Jim will talk a little bit about those. Those have changed in the last code cycle, and they're structural related, but it can trigger a building being brought up to current code.
Yeah, this topic, the rehabilitation triggers, are probably the bane of every structural engineer's existence out there who've ever done anything with DSA before. But the rehabilitation triggers are kind of important. The first really is that if you exceed 50% of the replacement value of a building that you're working on, that will in fact trigger our need to bring that building up to full compliance from a structural perspective. By bringing that up structurally, that will trigger accessibility requirements and certainly fire requirements as well. That's because of their rules, that's written into their regulations. We pretty much go off of a level of trust. If you come to us with a very simple classroom with very little plumbing or anything of that nature and claim $1,000 a square foot, we're going to call you on that. You're going to need to prove that $1,000 a square foot is what it's really going to cost to replace that building. Like on the same token, if you come to us with a very complicated science lab or where there's a lot of special equipment and you come in at $500 a square foot, we'll pretty much accept that value because we know that's in the range of what that cost is. So we will be trustful as long as doesn't get taken advantage of. There's another trigger, which is if you change the occupancy from one level to a higher risk occupancy level of the building during your modernization, then that will also trigger the fact that the building needs to be fully brought into structural compliance. And then the tricky one that causes most of the angst is that if you are to do work that's less than 50% of the replacement value, but you're increasing the seismic forces or the wind force on the structure by adding mass or by adding vertical surface by more than 10%, then that will trigger a full upgrade of your structure. Likewise, if you reduce the capacity of elements by more than 10% at that level, that'll also trigger a full seismic upgrade. And this is where the changes from the last cycle differ. In the past, you had an exception that kind of allowed you to knock out a wall as long as you came back in and provided an equivalent stiffness or strength. That's been changed a little bit, and the reason for that is that firms over and over and over again were taking advantage of the fact that they were making changes to certain walls, but they were leaving a deficient roof, or they were leaving other elements that were deficient. And time after time after time, we're watching these buildings continue to be rehabilitated or to be modernized, but the significant structural issues are not being touched. So the rules were modified a little bit, that when you exceed those triggers, then you will be asked to bring those buildings up into compliance. I know that's a tougher pill to swallow, but very important because buildings were just not being brought into compliance.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So we really encourage preliminary meetings. I think it really helps get the project off on the right foot. One thing I didn't mention about exempt projects is with all the different types of exempt projects, the district's not required to get written concurrence from DSA that the project is exempt, but you can if you'd like to, if you want to get that written concurrence. We have a procedure for that. Procedure 14-02 talks about the process. There's a $400 fee, and there's a form you fill out, Form 7. You fill out the top part of the form about the project. We open DSA Box for that project. You upload the drawings for the project into Box. We'll review those drawings. And if we concur the project's exempt from all 3 DSA reviews, we'll indicate so on the bottom of the form. We'll upload it to Box, and you'll have access to that. So you'll have a written record that your project is exempt. So Chet talked about the appointment system. There's a publication that goes into how that works. It's PR 1703, Project Submittal Appointment Process. And if you haven't done it, there is an email address for each regional office. You email the regional office requesting an appointment. Attached to your email, you include the filled out DSA1, the regular application you've always been using, and any attachments that go with that, like if it's an increment project, the DSA1 Inc form is an attachment. And then there's a new form, the DSA1 REG for registration. You fill that out, and that's the other attachment to your email. In that, you put your intended submittal date, original intended submittal date, when you plan to submit all the documents for review. And that date has to be between 6 and 8 weeks from when you send the email, not less than 6 weeks. And we don't want it more than 8 weeks, because if you schedule too far out, it's less likely that'll be an accurate date you're going to submit. So when we receive that email, hopefully that day or the next day you'd get an email back with the application number. We'll actually go ahead and sign the application number at that point. You don't need to submit the fees yet. You submit the fees when you submit the drawings and all the other documents for plan review. And in that email, it will indicate that DSA box for that project will be open very soon, and that we ask you to upload the progress drawings for the project to DSA box within 1 week. And the progress drawings they're not the drawings that are going to be used to review the project. Those are the drawings you submit later on your appointment date. It just is to give us an idea of the scope of the project, so that our supervisors can use that in order to determine how long the project will take. They're scheduling all of our staff for plan review out based on these drawings they look at, so they know how long it'll take, so then when they'll be available for the next project to keep everything running smoothly. Also, Chet mentioned that we have been receiving a lot of work lately, and so we're using overtime, but we're also using project consultants, and we use those progress drawings. We give the consultants access to those drawings, and we use that in order to negotiate a fee with the consultant for the review of those projects. And it takes a couple of weeks to do that negotiation and get the amendment approved for that particular project, approved and ready to go. So we're trying to do that during that 6-week appointment process. So by the time on your intended submittal date, you submit the project. If we are using a consultant, the amendment would already be approved. We just do the intake review to make sure the project's complete and send it to the consultant, and then they can start it right away. So it's important that you upload those progress drawings. It should be the entire set as it exists at that day: architectural, structural, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and please upload it as one PDF.
Just want to find out, maybe this is a good place to stop and see if
Sure.
they have any questions. Remember, we're trying to do this as a discussion, so if you've got some ideas, don't hold till the end. Any questions that Dan or the others have brought up so far? Great job.